Well, good morning, everybody. I got to tell you, I won't, needs to see me here. There we go. When I walked in here, I felt this overwhelming sense of gratefulness. Look at this place, how it's set up, and all the things I'm sure, these tiny little phones, and you all are able to project this stuff to all the people at home. It's just incredible. I'm so grateful for you all. And I'm an old man. I don't try to well up with emotion, but yeah, looking at this setup and how you've served us as a congregation is incredible. And Kelly, you are amazing. I can't tell you how many times I have felt blessed, whether it's been our COVID meetings and figuring out what the heck we were going to do with this stupid congregation, what we're going to clean and what not, or you showing up at the door and being there to say hello when I'd walk in, or I'd show my slides that I need shown and was worried they wouldn't be loaded. And then you'd look at me and smile and say, don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. Over and over again. You're a blessing to this congregation. This ordination is nothing more than a recognition of just the many things you've done for these people and us and me especially. So thank you. Okay. The title of the service for today, or of the talk today, is Called Outside Our Boundaries. I have no idea why it's that. Makes no sense to me whatsoever. But the scripture have a lot to do with the miracles of Jesus. So that's what I'm going to figure out. I'll talk about that then. So a primary reference for this talk that I'm using is Michael White in one of his lectures on magic, miracles, and the gospel, and Michael Simons Roberts, who's also a theologian. White is at Harvard. The scriptures have a fair number of references to the miracles of Jesus. If you look through them, you'll see there's a fair number of stories about this. And in some ways, and more than any other issue really in the development of early Christianity and the Gospels tradition, miracles present one of the problematic areas for many people today. And in the modern so-called scientific world, the treatment of miracles has been a problem in a number of ways, because we tend to want to explain away the miraculous in favor of more rationalistic explanations, many of which seem to be quite logical. During the Enlightenment, the early 1800s, 1700s, 18th century, Thomas Jefferson discounted miracles. In this period, most thinkers dealt with Jesus and the miracles by trying to explain them away or ignore them in some particular way. So let me give you a classic example of that. So in the case of Jesus walking on water, the typical explanation in the Sea of Galilee is he's walking near the water's edge, and it gets misty in the Sea of Galilee, either in the morning or in the evening, and it is kind of hard to see. And if you look out across, it could be that Jesus was walking in very shallow on the ground, but there was water underneath his feet. And that's how it appeared that he was walking on water, when in fact he wasn't. But it seems to me that we shouldn't ignore the miracles for the same reasons we take a lot of other aspects of the Christian tradition seriously. The people of the ancient world literally, seriously believed that miracles happened. There was no question, and it wasn't just Jews, it was everyone. Miracles happened all the time. So we have to try to put ourselves in their mindset of thinking about miracles, and then look to see how the stories are working. So this seems a better strategy to me than just trying to explain it away and say it really didn't happen. So try to disengage your mind, your modern mind, for a bit. And let's try to think with an ancient mind. And maybe we can make more sense of those stories and what's special about them. There's one more aspect of this, that is how the miraculous relates to the tradition itself of Jesus and the divinity of Jesus. It turns out that miracles themselves have an unclear position within early Christianity. The miracles of Jesus were not used uniformly. For example, Paul is arguably the most important figure in the establishment of Christianity, and he's the earliest source that we have for most of the oral tradition about Jesus. It all kind of starts with Paul. Interestingly, Paul never once mentions a miracle. attributed to Jesus. Not anywhere, other than the resurrection itself, which arguably wasn't Jesus's miracle. Paul doesn't have a version of the Christian tradition that stresses the miracles of Jesus as central to the understanding of who Jesus was and what his place is within the Christian tradition. The Gospels, of course, are a very different matter, perhaps because they have a different purpose. Another important aspect of the literature on Jesus is that since the Middle Ages, he has been seen as the Son of God. That's kind of what people in the middle 1500s believed about Jesus. He was the Son of God. And it's this title that most linked the miracles of Jesus to Jesus. In fact, in the Gospel of John, that's explicitly how the miracles are used. Jesus did many other signs and wonders. And if we tried to write them all down, they'd fill too many books. But these are given so that you might believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That's John 20:31. And that connection, the miraculous power and the divine nature of Jesus, is a very important connection for John in the later gospel tradition. It's interesting that in the Johannine tradition, Jesus is the Son of God because his miracles are real. That's what John says. Initially, Jesus's miracles prove he is the Son of God, and then the Johannine tradition reverses that and says his miracles are true because he's the Son of God, arguing both ways. And so no other miracles in the ancient world are actually true, would be what John would say. And I would say that both his dismissing miracles and this reversal on the use of miracles to prove that Jesus's miracles are the only ones that are true are both out of keeping with the ancient world and with the use of miracles in the Gospels tradition. So how do we make sense of it all? Remember, people in the first century and in the up to the Middle Ages for sure, until the Enlightenment, believed that miracles actually occur, that they were routine, they weren't something that was highly unusual. Magical powers were real. But this is not to say that they were unintelligible or irrational. They were an explanation, an understanding of the order of the world that allowed for the miraculous to happen. They had a magical worldview. That's everybody in the first century. And up until the Middle Ages, there was divination, there were oracles, dream interpretation, spells, curses, and many other aspects of medicine and healing that involved miracles. All were part of this magical worldview, as well as most aspects of what we would call straightforward religion. When Jesus in the Gospels, especially in the Gospel of Mark, performs a miracle, he says something in Aramaic. What he's doing, or at least what the author of Mark is doing from a Greek perspective, is using a mystical sounding magical word. Ablanathan alba. It's a palindrome. It's a word that reads the same backward as forward. Palindromes are spooky and magical. And all kinds of things like this are found throughout the ancient world. We have stories about magicians and miracle workers from the first century stories of what are usually called the divine men. They are stories about men with special powers. That is, these people were spread throughout the ancient world in quite a large number. And they look, in many cases, a lot like Jesus in terms of the miracles they perform. In fact, one of the most famous is Apollonius of Tyana, who is actually a real living figure, a contemporary of Jesus, but about whom was written an exceptional biography by the beginning of the 3rd century, portraying his childhood, his disappearance, his exceptional circumstances and precocious childhood, and his disappearance at the end of his life, so people really didn't think he died. He just disappeared. In fact, it looks very much like a competition gospel biography for Jesus. but not for the cult of Jesus at the time, but for the cult of Apollonius of Tyana. And one of the most important things is Apollonius performs miracles. For example, here is a miracle of Apollonius. A young girl seemed to have died, and in the very hour of her marriage, at the very hour of her marriage, and the bridegroom was weeping over his unfulfilled marriage. Apollonius happened to be present while they were mourning and said, "Put down the table, for I will end your weeping for this girl." And at the same time, he asked what was her name. He touched her and saying something no one could hear, probably a palindrome, awakened the girl who seemed to be dead. And the girl spoke and went back to her father's house, just like Alcestis, who was brought back to life by Hercules. And when the relatives of the girl offered Apollonius 150,000 silver pieces as a reward, he replied that he would return it to the child as a gift for her dowry. Does this miracle sound familiar to you? Raising a young girl? It's the miracle from Mark chapter 5. In fact, called the miracle of Jairus' daughter. A very, very similar miracle. In fact, it follows the pattern of the gospel miracle almost exactly. What we have to do is look at how these miracle stories are actually being used and what they're telling us about the tradition of Jesus. In Luke 7, Jesus interrupts a funeral ceremony to bring the deceased back to life. It isn't hard to picture the scene. The distraught mother weeping and wailing, supported by friends on either side, the confusion and unease as this stranger Jesus approaches. He goes to the coffin, telling the mother not to cry. The shock and sheer incredulity of the crowd as the boy sits up in his coffin and talks. The boy himself blinking in the daylight, brought him back to life. But what are we to make of it? Maybe Jesus really did bring the boy back from the dead. Or perhaps the boy wasn't dead in the first place, merely in a coma. There'll never be an answer to satisfy everyone. We just don't know. To those people who saw it happen, as the story goes, there's no doubt that Jesus had brought that widow's boy back to life. A pretty astounding thing to witness. No wonder they were filled with awe. But the triumph of life over death was not what really got the crowd going. If you look closely at this biblical account, you'll find that this miracle reminded the Jews that were watching it of another miracle that took place 1,000 years earlier, performed by one of the holiest men in Jewish history, the prophet Elijah. In fact, it more than reminded them of that story. The story is told in the book of Kings, goes that Elijah was staying with a widow in a town where the son fell ill. The woman began generously. She was generous in her hospitality to Elijah. So he was distressed to see that her son had grown worse and worse. The widow was desperate, consumed with grief, and Elijah brings the boy back to life. 1 Kings 17. The similarities between the two miracles are clear. A widow's only son, a premature death, a distraught mother met at the town's gate, a restoration of life by a holy man. Same circumstances, same outcome. The original Greek phrase at the end of the story in which Jesus gave him back to his mother's is identical with the phrase used in Elijah's story after his miracle. No wonder the crowds were astonished. Raised on the Jewish scriptures, taught to revere Elijah as the greatest of all the prophets, everyone who saw or heard about Jesus and the widow of Nain would have made a link to Elijah. Remember, first century people were not surprised by miracles, but a new rabbi who was like Elijah was worth mentioning. There's a hill located in the northeast shore of the Sea of Galilee, and in ancient times it was known as the desert. It's a bleak, uninhabited part of the landscape. But the Bible recounts that 2,000 years ago, on these dramatic desert slopes, Jesus fed a hungry crowd. The feeding of the 5,000 has always been one of the most memorable biblical stories. This apparently practical response to the physical needs of the crowd and the description of how it was done make it a wonderful story. All of us know it. Jesus does not stand over the meager loaves and fishes and then magically transform them into a banquet. Instead, he starts to break the bread and divide the fish and hand them to the crowd. But as he prays, the bread keeps breaking and the fish keeps dividing until everyone is fed. It sounds like the kind of miraculous sleight of hand, really. The original account can be found in the Gospel of Mark. The feeding of the multitude would put first century Jews in mind of a central figure in Jewish history. You know who that was? Someone even greater than the prophet Elijah. When those eyewitnesses saw Jesus handing out food, they could not help but think of the father of the Jewish faith himself, Moses. Everything about the miracle, from the setting right down to the smallest details, would suggest a powerful identification of Jesus with Moses. But why? To unravel the significance of this very similar miracle story, you have to go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls and understand the hopes and fears and expectations of first century Jews. The Jews at the time of Christ were anticipating the arrival of a great prophet, the Messiah. It seems that the Jews had a very clear idea about what this Savior was going to be like. It would have to be a man with the military and leadership qualities of the greatest military hero. Moses had freed the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt and had led them on a treacherous journey to freedom. It was a spectacular achievement, a cornerstone in Jewish history. The Jews at the time of Jesus were praying for a military savior who could do to the Roman oppressors what Moses had done to the Egyptians. But this would be difficult for anyone, never mind a miracle worker from the rural northern outpost in Galilee. How on earth could crowds imagine that Jesus might be the new Moses? Well, there are clues in the details of the miracle of the loaves and fishes, clues that betray striking symbolic parallels between Jesus and Moses. Those parallels begin where the story begins. When Jesus and his disciples get on a boat, they cross the waters of the Sea of Galilee and reach a place on the northeast shore of the lake known as the desert. That's what they call it. How had Moses' journey to the promised land gone? How did it start? Well, he first crossed the waters of the Red Sea, and then he had stopped in the Sinai desert. An interesting parallel, perhaps, but not enough to astonish the onlookers. However, once they reached the desert, Jesus' disciples asked him how they were going to eat. And so the loaves and the 5 fishes are going to feed a substantial crowd. As soon as Moses reaches the Sinai wilderness in the Hebrew story, the Hebrew people ask him, how are we going to eat in this barren landscape? Just before the miracle, Jesus orders the people to sit together in squares of hundreds and fifties. Moses orders his Hebrew people to sit down in companies of 100 or 50 strong. At the climax of the story, the miracle itself, Jesus hands out the loaves and fishes and somehow manages to multiply them so the food goes to everyone who needs it. Back in the Sinai desert, Moses presided over an equally miraculous multiplication of food. In the mornings that the grounds were covered with manna, the bread of heaven, like the fall of snow. In the evenings, the skies were filled with live quails, loaves and fishes, manna and quails. The menu may be different, but the significance would not have been lost on Jews. According to the Gospel of John, the people tried to mob Jesus after they had witnessed the miracle. That response is hardly surprising, as the possibility had dawned on them that this man, this very man, could be the Messiah, the leader who would overcome the Romans and liberate the long suffering of the Jewish people. Could Jesus be seen as the new Moses and the new Joshua? Well, there's nothing in the miracle of the loaves and fishes that suggests that. But that's the way the miracle signs work. You see, no single event do you ever get the whole picture, just a part of it. According to the gospel accounts, the feeding of the 5,000 is immediately followed by another extraordinary feat. And this time, the symbolism all points to Joshua. It strikes me that we haven't changed much, honestly, from our first century humans. We all want magic and miracles. And even if science has helped us to understand much of what was attributed to magic and miracles, even though we can explain them, we still want that. We want to believe that something fantastical, even though it may defy reality. Paul reflected on the message of the risen Christ, not the miracle stories. John wanted you to believe that Jesus was the Son of God because he was constantly behaving in miraculous ways. That's what people wanted to hear. And by the time of the Middle Ages, it was clear that the Jews were drawn to Christ because of the meaning of the miracles, not the miracles themselves. Could it be that this is manifested today in our belief in superheroes? It always strikes me odd that we're willing to watch crazy movies about people that used to be cartoon characters in comic books. Are we more prone to want the fantastical hero than a person who lives the Christian way? Why do so many go to movie theaters to watch actors pretend to be miraculous heroes? The Marvel Comics movie Avengers Endgame made $2.798 billion. One movie. What draws us to superheroes? It's not true. But that doesn't keep us from watching and trying to get meaning from it. What about the story of Captain America? Was he born a superhero? Some of you know, no, he was not. Steve Rogers didn't have superpowers, but he was a special person. He was always defined as someone who was defiant, unafraid, who continually chose to do the right thing despite the consequences. Even at the expense of his own identity, he would bend the rules to defend the innocent. He didn't want to kill anyone, and he disliked bullies. It was because of these qualities that he was chosen to be the person to receive the serum Vita Ray, which turned him into a superhero. But he was the person he was before the serum. The serum didn't make him the person he was. This treatment transformed him from a frail young man into a perfect specimen of human development. Does that sound even a little familiar to what we've been discussing this morning? Steve Rogers was the person he was without superpowers. The superpowers made him more attractive to us. Billions of dollars worth of more attractive to us, it turns out. Jesus was the person, the holy man. He was before the miracles, according to Paul. At least Paul felt no need to mention miracles, with the exception of the resurrection, of course, if he knew that they existed at all, to spread the message of Christ, which of course Paul was the primary person to do that. It wasn't at all a part. I can't say it wasn't a central part. It was not a part of the Christian message that Paul delivered. He never considered it important, or as far as he knew, it never happened. So we're all on our journey from where we came to go back to wherever we came. I think, you think about this, what does it all mean? And there's so little time for us. The only question for us, I think, really, as we study Christianity and try to live a Christian life, is how to find meaning in our lives in this brief time that we have. What's most important? How can we be useful and perhaps leave the world a little better than when we arrived? What else is there? Today, we have recognized Kelly Patton, who's been extremely helpful and a great congregational member. And you see her acts of kindness and support for us, I think, are really what matters. She doesn't need to do a miracle, or maybe that's what they are. Day in and day out, doing the right thing is not easy. Forgiving others as best we can, not judging people, and showing compassion to one another. That's the way, and that's a life worth living for.
If some of you at home need to secure bread and juice or water for communion, this would be a good time now to do it. We're going to prepare for communion now with number 528. Eat this bread, and we will sing it 3 times.